Hello, Yizhao Martins, licensed marriage and family therapist, couples therapist. So let's continue with the conversation from last week about those parts that get into the way, and then you start to punish yourself with your partner's ADHD symptoms. Shall we take a look at what they are? So I see two categories. One is when you're being activated and getting stressed and triggered by your partner's ADHD symptoms, you could very likely turning outside, externalize those stress and project certain things onto your partner, certain parts of you onto your partner. The other category is when you actually turning inside, internalize, and then you tend to fall into a place that's your collapse, maybe feeling low and depressed, having a strong inner critical voice about yourself. So let's take a look at the first one, shall we? There are many parts that can be activated. I summarize some of those parts that come in pairs that I see in couples, especially couples that their relationship is impacted by ADHD symptoms. So the first pair, I call them the victim and the villain. So for example, if one partner tend to be the one that doesn't have ADHD. We call the non-ADHD partner. I'm not saying it's always the truth. I just give you some examples that I see with my couples. The non-ADHD partner tend to say, they always treat me this way. They make me feel this way. That they did this to me. Right? So when you focus on their actions and how that impacted you, and implying that your emotions or your activation is closely tied to their behavior, that you are not free from that, you don't have any other choice, pay attention, you might be in the victim role. So the victim role seems like to be at the bottom, being bullied, being accused, being trained, being criticized, that never good enough. But if you take a look at it, the victim role is actually one up compared to the villain. So the villain is always the bad guy. I'm always the one that doesn't pick up the slacks. I'm always the one that having emotional outbursts. I'm always the one that make you cry, right? So those are the role they're in that cause negative impact on their partner. And ADHD partner tend to be identified or volunteered as the villain because their ADHD symptoms. For example, that their emotional dysregulation can come out as throwing tantrums, that make their non-ADHD partner feeling threatened, embarrassed, inconvenienced, right? And then they can be categorized as the bad one, the one that throws tantrum, the one that doesn't have good emotional regulation. So what happens when you're in this villain and victim and villain dynamic? While you lose capacity to see this inter relationship in a neutral and curious way, to solve the problem, to see that the dynamic is actually the problem in your relationship, not the bad guy, not the villain. Right? The non-ADHD partner or whoever is taking the victim role will likely to gather other people to gang up against the partner with ADHD or the villain in this case. To saying, well, they're the one that with the problem with ADHD that causing all this drama and trauma into our lives and our relationship. So in that way, when you are pointing finger at someone, you're actually, one up position. You are putting down the other person instead of looking at it as, well, their ADHD symptoms made our relationship very challenging, and we need to look for a different way to make it easier for us to live in the same household, to co-parent, to resolve financial difficulties, right? When you point finger at someone, you lose your capacity to be curious and to solve problems rationally and from a neutral place. So that's the villain, the victim, and the villain. a good parent. Let's put them aside. The second one, I call them the parent-child that I mentioned many times in our videos. So basically, the parent is the one that's very competent, and the child tend to be the one that's dependent or lack certain skills and certain capacities. You probably already can tell, right? In the ADHD partners, if there's one partner with ADHD, the other one doesn't, the non-ADHD partner tend to be the parent or the competent one, and the ADHD partner tend to be identified as the incompetent, the dependent, the lack skills, the child in some way. And again, the non-ADHD partner in this dynamic is one up, the ADHD partner is one down. That creates a non-equal relationship. Another variation of that is the rule stickler and the rebels. So you can see that a lot, especially in co-parenting relationships, where the rule stickler is the one-up one saying, well, I'm the good parent, that I follow the rules, I get the kids to school on time, I turn in homework for the kids on time, right? When the other parent tends to be the one always late, that miss schools with the kids, and not turning homework or homework is missing when they're under their care. So that also creates this role that each parent in, and the dynamic is not equal again. So that is the parent and the child. We put them aside again. The third one is also very common. It's called the doctor or the savior versus the identified patient. So the doctor and the savior tend to be very intellectual, and their caregivers, they tend to pull out from the dynamic and being very, very intellectualized and rational and pointing finger at the identified patient. Your problem. Your ADHD is the problem. Are you taking your medication? Did you take any coffee? Was it interacting with your medication? Are you using the strategies your therapist prescribed for you, the CBT? Are you using any calendars? So basically, the doctor partner become the therapist or the doctor or the nutritionist trying to fix the problem that they perceive in the identified patient, and also volunteer the identified patient's problem as the problem in the relationship. So the underneath saying is, if you can fix them, we're okay. Our problem is gone. So I often get that at the beginning of a session, where even intake, when one partner point finger at the other partner, say, only if they do this, our relationship will be no problem, will be good. Okay? Another variation of this is the fixer, or I call problem solver, and the problem, or the wounded dog. And they're a really good pair. They attract each other because the fixer loves solving problems and fixing people, and the problematic one that tend to be, well, I'm just weak and incapable. Please help me, right? But then there's a part of the identified patient that rebels against, doesn't want to be fixed because they lose their autonomy, right, and agency in this relationship. They are not an equal relationship. Remember, a therapist and the client, a doctor and the patient, they don't have equal relationships. So doctor, the therapist has all the power over the clients or the patient. So is that the dynamic you want to create in your relationship? Right, put that aside. The last one I give it to you is called the scapegoater and the scapegoat. Right? The scapegoat is the one that's the scapegoat are trying to get rid of. If you're gone, all the things are good. That sounds a little bit familiar, right, with identify the patient and the doctor one. But in that dynamic, they're not trying to get rid of the identified patient. They're trying to fix them, trying to cure them, trying to heal them. In the scapegoater and scapegoat relationship, they are actually trying to get rid of that person. For example, that happens a lot more in co-parenting relationship. When one parent identifies as the good parent, right? The competent one, and volunteer the other one as the bad parent and not competent, the child in the dynamic. And they tend to advocate for, if we can get rid of that parent, our children will be just fine. The other parent is the problem that caused so much damage to our children's development. And then they fight on every single thing in their parenting activities together. So let me repeat them. The victim and the villain, the child, the parent and the child, the doctor, savior, and the identified patient, the scapegoater and the scapegoatee. And on the left side, they're always the one that have one up position that's higher. They put themselves higher and they put down the other person to be lower. That creates an unequal relationship in this dynamic. So that is what I call the externalizers. They tend to get some of their aggression or their feelings projected out on the other person and fix the other person or get rid of them. So they don't have to face it themselves. And oftentimes they have a part that is the villain, is the child, is the identified patient and the scapegoat. And they're trying to project it out to the other person and fix that part or leave that part. So in some way that's not integrated. So the other side is when you internalize, and then when you have a very strong inner critical part that attack yourself and calling yourself the villain, the child, the identified patient, and the scapegoat. And when you're trying to do to that yourself, what happens? You collapse, feeling depressed, and often the statements I hear is, well, I need to be better to be loved. I'm not good enough to be loved. No matter how much I try, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy for this love and acceptance. And what's really underneath that collapse in depression, withdrawal, or isolation is this a very vulnerable, tender young part that wanting love and wanting 100% unconditional acceptance that doesn't trust this is going to happen to them. So they tend to bring that critical part to keep the self in check so they don't get disappointed. I know, it's very sad. So either way, you project that part out to the other person, or you're turning that part and beating yourself down. Either way is not helpful because the vulnerable part that wants love and acceptance is not able to be seen and held and healed, right? So what is the alternative? What are the other options besides externalizing, internalizing? It sounds like that's it, right? The polarized, externalizing, internalizing. But there is a middle ground. You can do it on your own without giving it to other people or beating yourself down. We'll talk about that next week, part 3, how to be with yourself and know those parts without projecting it out and attack that on other people. We call it an outer critic. Or turning back at yourself and beat yourself down, kind of inner critic. How to be in the middle. We'll see you next time.